welcoming everyone. I will quickly run through some important housekeeping items. To begin with, all phone lines have been muted and microphones have been turned off to reduce background noise. We ask that you please keep your phones on mute during the presentation. This session will include participation through polls, and we encourage everyone to participate. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat pod at any time, as it will be monitored throughout the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and archived. The recording, along with other materials, will be posted soon on the NCDB website. I will put a link for that page in the chat pod shortly. All right, I'm going to start the recording and hand this over to Linda McDowell, our project director, to get this started.
Good afternoon. This is Linda McDowell, and I'm the co-director at the National Center on Deaf-Blindness. I want to share with you that during the months of July through January, as a part of our Deaf-Blind Summit 2020, NCDB is holding 6 webinars on instructional strategies and resources of interest to families and educators of children and youth who are deaf-blind, as well as state deaf-blind project personnel. And the link that Haley has put there in our website, it will take you to those 6 instructional strategy sessions, and you'll find descriptions and resources there. Resources for each of the instructional strategy sessions held so far include session recording, a PowerPoint, and a fact sheet. And these fact sheets have key points and resource links. The fact sheet for today's session is already on the website. In July, we were pleased to have Dr. Susan Bruce and Dr. Tracy Evans-Uselli bring us strategies and materials on establishing routines at home that were particularly applicable to children and youth who are emerging communicators. And while the majority of the children and youth served by state deafblind projects are emerging communicators, there is a growing number who are proficient communicators and are being served in the general education classroom. So in September, we were pleased to have Deanna Peterson and Nancy O'Donnell bring us resources for meeting the needs of proficient communicators. Now here in October and in the 2 November sessions, our focus is on accessing the general education curriculum, including information on academic standards for students with significant cognitive disabilities, and early literacy and numeracy. Again, please see the descriptions for these 3 sessions on either of the websites. The links that Haley has put in the chat will take you there. And I want to say before I move any farther is that ensuring that all students have access to the general education curriculum is a priority to OSEP. OSEP funds us in our technical assistance. And to support this effort, our project officer, Susan Weigert, has encouraged our partnership with national centers who focus on this outcome. Susan's here with us today, and she will introduce the presenters for this topic. Susan?
Hi there. Thank you so much, Linda. I today want to introduce our 2 speakers whom I work very closely with in my other capacity as the project officer for the TIES Center. These 2 are Cheryl Lazarus, Dr. Cheryl Lazarus, who is the director of TIES Center, and Martha Thurlow, who also is serving in an advisory role for the TIES Center, and whom you all may know as the former director of the National Center on Educational Outcomes. So Cheryl is the director, as I said, of the TIES Center, and TIES stands for increasing the time, the instructional effectiveness, the engagement, and the state and district support for inclusive practices. And when we say inclusive practices, we're talking about students with the most significant cognitive impairments. And TIES Center is the Department of Education's National Technical Assistance Center on Inclusive Practices and Policies, and it's funded by the Office of Special Education Programs. So TIES works with states, with districts, with schools to support the movement of students with disabilities from less inclusive to more inclusive environments. As the director of TIES Center, Cheryl conducts research and provides technical assistance on educational change processes that will support and sustain the inclusion of all students, including students with deaf-blindness, in inclusive learning settings. She seeks to address the complex and interrelated root causes that contribute to barriers to inclusion and works to build consensus and capacity among practitioners and policymakers. Cheryl is also the director of the National Center on Educational Outcomes. She has published extensively, including more than 200 articles and reports on topics related to the instruction and assessment of students with disabilities, English learners, and English learners with disabilities. Martha Thurlow is the former director of the National Center on Educational Outcomes and now serves in an advisory role for the TIES Center. She addresses the implications of contemporary U.S. policy and practice for students with disabilities and English learners, including national and statewide assessment policies and practices, and standard-setting efforts and graduation requirements. And Martha's specialty area of focus includes the development and implementation of policies and practices that include all students, including students with significant cognitive disabilities. So as an advisor to the TIES Center, Martha contributes to all aspects of the project, including its knowledge development efforts and its technical assistance work with states. With that, I'll turn it over to Cheryl.
Oh, thank you, Susan. It's a joy to be talking with all of you today. And I know that Martha and I really enjoyed putting together this presentation as we've thought through and worked with Linda to think about, exactly what instruction might look like for students who are deaf, blind, and the key role that academic standards play in all of that. So let's go ahead and get going. Now I need to figure out the hard part. I need to figure out how to move a slide. Okay. As Susan said, I'm the director, or two projects are involved in this work that we are presenting today, and CEO of the National Center on Educational Outcomes and TIES Center. Let me tell you just a bit about NCO. NCO is the National Technical Assistance Center to increase the participation and performance of students with disabilities on state and district-wide assessments. We've been around a while. The center was first funded in 1990, and the purpose of NCEO is to increase the inclusion of students with disabilities and English learners with disabilities in assessment systems. And that goes across the whole range of assessments, from formative assessment practices that might be used in a classroom to make minute-by-minute, day-by-day instructional decisions, to interim assessments, as well as to those summative statewide tests that are typically administered once a year. NCEO serves both state and district assessment offices, as well as state and district special education offices. And also for those students with disabilities who are English learners, we also work with English language development offices, as well as with national testing organizations. Now, and Susan's already told you a bit about TIES Center, so I'll go through this really, really quickly. But TIES Center is the National Technical Assistance Center on inclusive policies and practices for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. The purpose of the center is to create sustainable changes in K-8 educational systems so that students with significant cognitive disabilities can fully engage in the same activities as their general education peers in the same manner that it supports increased engagement and learning outcomes in general education classes and other general education contexts. Now, not going to go through it again, but here's a little schematic that shows what TIE stands for. The increasing time, instructional effectiveness, engagement, and the S is state support. The purpose of this presentation, we really have it divided into basically 3 sections. First, we'll clarify just a bit the standards terminology, because that can be so easy and to get really, really confusing. That there's a lot of very similar terms, all of which mean different things, but it just can become confusing. So let us clarify that just a bit. We will then talk a little about the role of standards for students with significant cognitive disabilities, including English learners with significant cognitive disabilities, and we'll answer questions. We'll have a few polls along the way to just get a bit of sense of what you are thinking, and also encourage you throughout the presentation, as Haley said, to put things in the chat box and we can address your questions that way. I'm now going to turn it over to Martha.
Great. So I'm going to start by talking about who we are talking about when we talk about students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So that terminology is included in federal education law and regulations, but there isn't a category in IDEA. There's not a disability category of most significant cognitive disabilities. So states are supposed to define who those students are. So you are each in a state that has undertaken an attempt to define these students. We have looked at the definitions that states have. The most frequent characteristics in those definitions are that there is significantly affected cognitive and adaptive functioning, that the student requires extensive individualized instruction and or supports, and that often the student benefits from modifications to assignments and learning materials. We have looked at students who have been identified as having the most significant cognitive disabilities and find that the most frequent primary IDEA categories are intellectual disability, autism, and multiple disabilities. But of course, not all students in those categories can be considered to have significant cognitive disabilities. See if I can remember. Okay, so a little bit of clarification. Most students with disabilities, including those who are deaf-blind, should participate in the general assessment with needed accommodations. Only a small percentage of students, and that includes students who are deaf-blind, should participate in the alternate assessment based on alternate academic achievement standards. And those students who participate in that alternate assessment are the students who meet the state's participation guidelines, which require, include that requirement for a significant cognitive and adaptive behavior impairment.
Hey, Martha, this is Haley Marcotte. I think we lost your audio. I don't know if Martha can hear me.
Why don't I jump in? This is Cheryl, and I'll get get it going, and then as soon as Martha gets her audio going again, we'll take it back. And this, where I think we were when she lost her audio, was discussing academic standards, and the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, primarily uses the term academic standards. But there's many, many other terms that are used by educators and policymakers, and this is part of the reason that it's kind of hard sometimes to keep it all straight. Some of the other terms that are used are academic content standards, alternate standards, extended standards, achievement standards, performance standards, and English language proficiency standards. And of course, different ones of these mean different things. So let's talk a little bit more about this. That the terms all have different meanings, and we really, really need to be very clear about terms that are used and their meaning, and we need to we're going to talk a bit and try today to clarify the relationship among these terms and their roles in instruction and assessment. Martha, is your sound back? I don't think so. So I will do another couple. You sound back?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. It just disappeared. Anyway, thank you, Cheryl, for continuing. And now I was so busy trying to get myself back in the audio that I lost track of where you were in terms of academic content standards. So how far had we gotten?
We were just talking about how there's so many different names for standards and how it can sometimes be confusing, and ready to talk about academic content standards.
Okay. All right. So as Cheryl may have already said, states develop their own content standards. They often call them college and career ready content standards or standards. And they identify what students should know and be able to do at each grade. So those content standards define the goals of instruction for all students in a grade, and that includes students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. It includes English learners and English learners with disabilities and with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So that leads us to the first question, and that's for you, thinking about your state. Do you know where to find your state's academic standards? And Haley will pull up the poll, which gives you the option of saying, yes, I have looked at them, yes, but I have not looked at them, or no vote. And so we see that most people indicate that they have looked at their state's academic content standards. So that's really good. If you, and very few say they have not at all looked at them. And some have looked at them, but, some have found them but not really looked at them. So that's good. It's a good basis for starting. And now I'll turn it back to Cheryl.
So let's look at a few examples of the academic content standards. For an example, let's look at, and these are generic, they vary as Martha indicated, that there's differences from state to state, but yet they really are quite strong similarities from one state to the next. So for just a generic state example, for grade 4 math, an academic content standard might be apply the area and perimeter formulas for rectangles in real-world and mathematical problems. And for grade 8, a reading language arts standard might be something like determine a theme of a text and analyze its development over the course of the text including its relationship to the characters, setting, and plot. And I think that we may have not dug very deeply into, but the content standards are the same for all students, that they aren't different for students with significant cognitive disabilities, including children who are deaf-blind, than what they are for other students. That the content standards are the same for all students. Also, the federal education laws do not permit an alternate curricula for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And the actual language in IDEA is IEP goals are designed to meet the child's needs that result from the child's disabilities, to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. Now, where there are differences are that there's, in addition to the content standards, which describes, the curriculum, what the student is instructed in, there are also academic achievement standards, and these are developed for the state assessment, are designed to show what a student needs to know and to do to perform on the state test. These may be the grade level achievement standards, and the grade level achievement standards are those that are used with the general assessment, or there also are alternate academic achievement standards. These standards are for the alternate assessment. And all students are learning grade level content, but it's at different levels of breadth, depth, and complexity. And that is how it is shown in the achievement standards. These standards, the alternate achievement standards can provide useful information about what is expected of students. Now, let's come back to our example of grade 4 math, and you may remember that in the example, the content standard was apply the area and perimeter formulas for rectangles in real world and mathematical problems. For a student who is taking the general assessment, the grade level achievement proficient descriptor, so a student who is proficient would be able to solve problems that include calculating area and perimeter, including those in which side lengths are missing. For this same content standard, the alternate achievement proficient level descriptor may be student solves problems using perimeter and area. Now, what are some possible ways that a student might be able to access the alternate achievement standard? Well, for that grade 4 example, the student may be able to solve problems of perimeter and area by using tactile cubes or a braille ruler to measure the sides of a cardboard rectangle. Cubes are also used to solve for area. Going back a few slides to where we looked at the ELA reading content standard, which was addressed themes of a text that students, the alternate achievement proficient level descriptor might be the student reads via teacher presented version of an adapted text and responds by choosing a tactile representation of the theme or by using their typical communication method. Now, we shouldn't be confused. that other terms, and, I've been using the term alternate achievement proficient level descriptor, but some other terms that are sometimes used to refer to these performance expectations that you'll often see in some of the state policies are extended standards, essence statements, core content, or alternate standards. These are all terms that can be used to refer to expectations on the alternate assessment. We are now to polling question number 2. So if Haley could pull that up, what terminology is used for the performance expectations for students in your state who take the alternate assessment? Extended standards, essence statements, core content, alternate standards, other terminology, or don't know. As I look at this, there's definitely variation across states, definitely showing that those of you attending this webinar are from a variety of different states that are using different terminology. The one that is popping up being as the most frequent is alternate standards. May not have the word achievement in there, but just the alternate standards, that's 62%. Others that are in the, 10-15% range that are commonly used amongst those of you participating in this webinar are, let's see, extended standards, extended standards, and then other terminology is similarly 13%. Just use some other term in your states. About the same percent, you just don't know. It's what it is. And then fewer of you are in states using the terminology of essence statements or core content. But you might want to, as you just poke around on your state's alternate assessment web pages, might just poke around, look and see what the achievement standards are called in your state, what those alternate achievement proficiency descriptors are called, and look at them a little, because it really does provide some useful information about what students who participate in alternate assessments are expected to know and to do. I'm going to turn it back to Martha now.
All right, thank you. So one of the things I noted in the chat that from Natalie is that Pennsylvania uses the term alternate eligible content. And so you can see with all these different terms how it can be so confusing when we start talking about content standards that are same, achievement standards that are different. But in your states, you're using all different terms for those. So hopefully we're helping clarify the difference between content standards and achievement standards. And if we haven't for you, please add a question to the chat or just a comment saying you're totally not understanding what we're trying to say. I'm going to go ahead, though, because standards and curriculum are essential as we think about the instruction for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. That means we need to go back to that statement that regardless of the student's disabilities and access needs, all instruction is to start from the same content standards, regardless of the student's disabilities, or sort of said that twice. Expectations for how much a student will master of the grade level curriculum, that can be modified. So assignments and materials can be adapted to meet individual student needs. As Cheryl noted, there can be less depth, breadth, and complexity in terms of what is achieved, what is learned. And then regardless, there always need to be needed accommodations provided for the student, as long as we understand that those accommodations do not change the content. Okay. So I'm going to, one other clarification that might be helpful as we think about this. So as Cheryl was talking, she identified what a grade level achievement standard looked like and what an alternate achievement standard looked like and how those might be assessed. In your state, there's more than just the proficient level. So, and sometimes the number of levels differ for the general assessment and the alternate assessment in terms of those achievement levels. Very often for the alternate assessment, there are 3 levels. So we talked about the proficient level. That's the critical level when you come to assessment. But you may have other levels like approaching the standard or nearing the standard, as well as proficient on the standard. So just because I do think that helps when we think about how those standards can help us as we think about our curriculum and what we teach to students. So I'm going to move on to a few guiding principles. So there needs to be evidence that there is the same grade level aligned content for all students with disabilities, including those with significant cognitive disabilities. I think you could see that in the examples that Cheryl provided. The same content standards are used as for all other students, as the grounding. All subject areas are provided to, that are provided to the peers are also provided to the students with disabilities. So for example, excuse my voice. For example, it's not just reading or just reading and math, but it's all of the content areas that your state has identified and in its standards, and that instruction is provided to students without disabilities. And then, as always, those decisions about needed accommodations or needed modifications to assignments and materials, those are always tailored to the individual student. So having the same content standard does not change that. All right, so a few do's and don'ts that help kind of gel this concept. So do start instruction from the same grade level standards as for all other students in that grade. And here we think universal design for learning is really important to make the lessons accessible and effective for the whole class, including that student with the most significant cognitive disabilities, including the student who is deaf-blind with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So don't use content standards from a lower grade to organize a student's curriculum, assignments, and resources. So there may be scaffolding needed, but it doesn't mean going to a lower grade to look at what the content is there. A couple more do's and don'ts. Do provide instruction to all students with disabilities in all subject areas that are provided to students without disabilities. And don't, this looks like the same one, sorry, don't use standards from a lower grade. Sorry if I missed something. Third one, do tailor instruction and materials for the individual student using accommodations, modifications, and adapted materials as appropriate. And don't use a separate curriculum designed, for example, for all students with disabilities or all students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Those are risky because they are likely to not be aligned with the grade level content standards. I've highlighted at the bottom of this slide an encouragement for you to attend session 2, the next webinar on accessing grade level general education curriculum. It's got ideas for key components of providing access to and progress in the grade level general education curriculum. So I really encourage you to participate in that webinar. All right, I want to highlight a couple resources that are helpful. One is one that's been around quite a while, referred to as AAAAS, which is what we first called the alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards, leaving out that critical term academic. So we now always make sure we're referring to alternate assessment based on alternate academic achievement standards. But this brief really clarifies standards that are same but different. And that's what we've been trying to explain today. But if we have not gotten it to you, do get to that brief. It's a really good one. And then shown here is another brief called the General Education Curriculum, not an alternate curriculum. And this brief is really intended for parents, but is a good source of information. It highlights what parents might need to know so that they can participate in discussions about instruction for their child who has significant cognitive disabilities. And so very helpful resource for parents as they go into an IEPT meeting where there's a discussion about perhaps the participation in the alternate assessment and then what that means for instruction for the child. So I encourage you to look at both of those. One more resource I want to highlight, and this one is another TIES resource entitled Providing Meaningful General Education Curriculum Access to Students with Cognitive Disabilities. This resource is one that was developed for educators. So it really highlights information that educators need to know when they participate in discussions about instruction for the child with the most significant cognitive disabilities. It goes into more depth about the topic. It also has some very specific examples of what might happen in a classroom for a student with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So I encourage you to look at that resource also. Okay, I'm going to kind of jump to another topic, and that is English learners with disabilities. So there have been increasing numbers of students who are progressing toward their English language proficiency. They're perhaps called English learners or English language learners in your state. The percentage, numbers and percentages of those students are growing. They represent about 10% now of school-age students. And approximately 9% of English learners have disabilities, and some of those, of course, have the most significant cognitive disabilities. There's lots of variability in these students, even though Spanish may be the most frequent language. That's not the most frequent language in all of our states, so you may be in a state where the Spanish is not the most frequent language. There are many languages and many cultures represented, so it's important to be thinking about that variability when thinking about students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who are also learning English. Critical to remember that these students require both English language development services and special education services. We found in some of our research in the past few years that there has been, hopefully this is much more infrequent, there was some tendency for IEP teams or those making decisions to say, well, special education services trump everything else, so we're not going to worry about English language development. We'll depend on special ed. And that's a mistake. It's really important to have both of those services provided to those students and to have English language development experts involved in the IEP team meetings for those students. So like other students with disabilities, English learners with disabilities are to be held to the same grade level standards and have access to the same general education curriculum as their peers. And that means that they are held to the same grade level English language proficiency standards for reading, writing, speaking, and listening, with some held to alternate ELP achievement standards. So this gets at the requirement that English learners not only are assessed and taught in terms of the academic standards, but also in terms of English language proficiency standards. So we need for those students really to be attending to both of those. And we have a comment in the chat box that, you know, this can be really complicated when the student is also a sign language user. And that is exactly right. It's a very complicated, you know, even if the student is an oral speaker or, you know, speaks orally. But it gets more complicated the more involved the student is. But that doesn't mean we should forget the need for both kinds of services. All right, and I'll just give an example here of what an ELP standard is like. So for this example shows it's a grade 4-5 reading. Now remember, the English language proficiency looks at those 4 domains, reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So this is one in the reading area, where a grade level achievement, proficient achievement descriptor could be the student reads grade level text and identifies main idea and supporting ideas. An alternate achievement at the proficient level descriptor might be with prompting and support. The student uses an emerging set of strategies to identify main topic and read aloud text or simple written text. Again, as I said, for content-based achievement standards, we've only given you the proficient level here, but very often there are many other, or 3 or more other levels that describe students who are maybe far below the proficient level to approaching it, to near, etc. So those different levels can help you think about the nature of instruction for these students. All right, that brings us to our third polling question. And that is, thank you, Haley, do you know where to find your state's English language proficiency standards? And the options are yes, and I've looked at them, yes, but I've not looked at them, and no. We're getting some responses here. I'll hold a minute. And it's changing a little. It looks like the highest percentage either say yes, but I haven't looked at them, or no, I don't know where to find them. So, and then about 27% saying yes, and I have looked at them. So that's an important thing to try to do in your spare time, and that's especially important if you have an English learner with a significant cognitive disability. And just one more warning before I turn it over to Cheryl. Sometimes it's very difficult to know if your student with the most significant cognitive disability, especially if your student is deaf-blind, whether that student is also learning English. So sometimes it takes a lot of digging to determine that, but it's really important to know, to be able to blend those English language development services and special education services. So thank you, Haley. And I'll turn it now to Cheryl, I think.
The place to start, the place to really be thinking about is instruction. That there is really a triangle of things that all work together. There's instruction, curriculum, and assessment. But as we think about it, let's focus on, hone in for a bit on the instructional component. That it's very important to ensure access to the same content standards for all students, including those with significant cognitive disabilities. And for those students who are English learners, it's also important to ensure access to the English language development standards. These can be done by including, for English learners, including English language development educators in all IEP team meetings, providing both special education and English language development services, as Martha indicated, and to be sure to identify needed accommodations for all students with disabilities, and for those who are English learners with disabilities, it's important to also identify linguistic accommodations for access to the content, and state guidelines should be used for identifying which accommodations might be used. There's several good resources related to English learners with disabilities. The first is, and this is, I don't know, hot off the press, it's only been out for a month or two, the Assessment Principles and Guidelines for English Learners with Disabilities. That this was originally published 8 or 10 years ago, and we just recently updated it because there was so much good information in these guidelines, but to make it make it appropriate in the current context. So be sure to take a look at that. And then a related project that we have is one that's funded through the Office of English Language Acquisition, and you might want to take a look at the web page for that project. That project is called Improving Instruction for English Learners Through Accessibility Decision Making, and there's lots of good information on those web pages. There's also links to a number of resources in a parent educator toolkit, including many like one-pagers for parents that have been translated into 5 different languages. So you might want to take a look at that. Our next polling question is an open response. What content would help you in your work? What would you find useful as you're thinking about standards and the things that we've been discussing today? What would be helpful?
And can I jump in? I think we were asking what content support would help you in your work. Maybe it's the same, but...
Martha said it much better than I did.
Sample IEP goals and activities is one answer. Concrete examples. Clarification between IEP goals and academic standards. Clear directives and policies. Oops, something's happening.
Yeah, a couple more popped in. Let's see. Teaching literacy for students with sensory impairment. They're not coming in exactly with one order. They're kind of, so let me see. So many standards require understanding of requisite concepts and concept development. It's so different for students who are deaf-blind. It takes much longer. So I think examples that apply to students who are deaf-blind with additional disabilities would be helpful.
Good.
Let's see, another one's elementary versus secondary approaches. communication support.
Teaching reading to deaf students when there's not a teacher of the deaf on staff or IEP. Oh dear. These are really good. I'm hoping that we will keep these so that we can go back to them and think about perhaps some things that we can put together that would be helpful. You know, when I saw the example of, you know, something about more specific examples, I would refer you again to that TIES brief about the general education curriculum, not an alternate curriculum. It does have specific examples, but the extent to which they are specific for students who are deaf-blind, I can't remember, but I don't think we have an example like that. So, I mean, I do think that's something that maybe we could work on together with the National Center for Deaf-Blindness. Are there more coming in? Oh, and yes, thank you, Jessica from TIES Center has reminded me that they're going to dig into more specific examples in the next 2 webinars. So I highlighted webinar 2. So in the next 2 webinars, you're going to get into more specific examples. Thanks for the reminder. Okay, and we had a little hearing problem, but I think we're okay now. And Linda indicated she'll send us the responses from the poll. Thank you.
So now it's your turn to ask us any questions, any things that we should be, what you'd like to discuss, any questions you may have. So I'd like to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and you can see Martha's and my contact information on the slide that's up on the screen. So just shoot us an email if you think of any questions later.
There is a link to the evaluation in the chat box. Oh, and there it is. And what else are we hearing? Multiple people are typing, so the list that you provided of what other content support you would like is really good. That helps us a lot in thinking through where to go next in terms of what's happening. And of course, that also encourages you to stay tuned and tune into the next 2 webinars provided by our colleagues. Section 2, the next webinar is November 4th. Great.
All right, I think that looks about it for questions. Looks like everyone's just saying thank you. So yes, again, please fill out the evaluation survey. We greatly appreciate your feedback, and thank you for your participation. That concludes today's webinars. Thank you, our presenters. This was wonderful. And the recording and materials will be posted on the NCDB website in the next day or so. All right, I'm going to close the meeting now, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.